May 8, 1945. Somewhere along the Elbe River. The war had ended 3 hours ago. In the fading light of that spring evening, a column of American trucks rolled through the shattered remains of a German town whose name had long been erased by artillery fire. The air tasted of ash and lilac, death and rebirth mingled in the same breath. Along the roadside, women in threadbare coats stood motionless, their faces carved from stone, their eyes following the vehicles with the blank intensity of those who had learned to expect nothing and fear everything. Then came the sound. It was laughter, bright, unguarded, rolling across the rubble like something from another world. It came from the back of a supply truck where 3 American WWIIs sat perched on crates of rations, their olive-drab uniforms dusty but crisp, their faces animated with the kind of joy that seemed impossible in such a landscape. One of them, a corporal from Ohio, threw her head back as another told a joke, her auburn hair catching the last rays of sunlight. The sound of their amusement echoed off broken walls, defiant and strange. The German women stared. Their hands, clutched at the collars of their coats, tightened. Their mouths, thin lines that had forgotten how to curve upward, remained sealed. But their eyes widened, something flickering behind the exhaustion, confusion, perhaps disbelief, maybe even the faintest spark of recognition at something they had once known but could no longer name. For in that laughter lay a truth more devastating than any bomb. These women in uniform were free. To understand the magnitude of that moment, one must step back through the architecture of ideology that had defined Germany for 12 years. The National Socialist vision of womanhood was not merely cultural. It was engineered, legislated, celebrated, and enforced with the same mechanical precision that built the tanks and sorted the camps. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. This trinity formed the blessed boundaries of female existence, a prison painted as paradise, servitude dressed as sacred duty. The propaganda was relentless. From the moment Hitler seized power in 1933, German women were bombarded with images of the ideal Mutter, serene, subservient, endlessly fertile. The Reich's marriage loan program offered financial incentives to women who quit their jobs upon marriage. The Mother's Cross Awards, bronze for 4 children, silver for 6, gold for 8, transformed wombs into medals of honor. By 1939, over 3 million such crosses had been distributed, each one a glittering chain. In schools, girls learned geometry only as it applied to household management. Biology classes focused on racial hygiene and the production of healthy Aryan offspring. Physical education prepared them for the rigors of childbirth, not competition. The League of German Girls drilled them in folk songs and domestic science, teaching that true feminine power lay in abnegation, in the dissolution of self into service. Gertrude Scholz-Klink, the Reich women's leader, toured the country proclaiming that the mission of woman is to minister in the home and in her profession to the needs of life from the first to last moment of man's existence. To laugh freely, spontaneously, without permission or purpose, this was not merely discouraged. It was ideologically suspect. Joy that served no function, that answered to no authority, that arose from nothing but one's own spirit. This was the dangerous frivolity of the individualist, the liberal, the degenerate. German women learned to modulate every expression, to calibrate every emotion to the demands of duty. Their faces became masks, their voices instruments tuned to a single frequency, obedience. And then came the war, which transformed servitude into suffering. By 1943, the myth had begun to crack, though the mask remained in place. With millions of men at the front, women flooded into factories, working 12-hour shifts in armament plants while still maintaining the fiction that their primary identity was maternal. They queued for hours for bread rations that grew smaller each month. They slept in bomb shelters, emerging to find their homes reduced to dust. They wrote letters to husbands and sons whose replies arrived less frequently, then not at all. They learned to read death in the formal language of Wehrmacht telegrams. The propaganda adapted but never relented. Now women were told their suffering was sacrifice, their exhaustion was heroism, their silence was strength. Durchhalten, hold out, endure, persist. Goebbels' speeches took on an apocalyptic fervor, speaking of destiny and doom in the same breath, promising that through absolute destruction would come rebirth. German women heard these words in darkened cinemas and shuttered living rooms, and they held their faces still, and they did not laugh. Then came the final year. The Eastern Front collapsed. The bombing intensified. Cities became moonscapes. Refugees from the East brought stories that froze the blood. The careful architecture of the Reich, its bureaucratic precision, its mythological certainty, began to dissolve into chaos. Yet even then, even as the world they knew disintegrated, German women maintained the disciplines they had learned. They queued orderly for rations that no longer came. They reported rumors to authorities who no longer existed. They kept their faces composed, their emotions contained. To break, to weep, to express despair, this would be weakness, betrayal, submission to the very chaos the Führer had promised to eliminate. And then the Americans arrived. The first encounters were tentative, wary, structured by fear and hunger. In the spring of 1945, as Allied armies swept across Germany from both east and west, millions of Germans confronted the enemy they had been taught to imagine as monsters. Soviet troops came with rage and vengeance. Their arrival brought horrors that would haunt generations. But the Americans came with something more disorienting than cruelty. They came with abundance. The supply columns seemed endless. Trucks laden with food, medicine, fuel, equipment, more material than the Wehrmacht had seen in years. GIs handed out chocolate bars to children, cigarettes to men, tins of meat and fruit to starving civilians. They set up field kitchens that produced hot meals in quantities that seemed impossible. German observers noted with bewilderment that American soldiers sometimes discarded rations they found unappetizing, threw away half-smoked cigarettes, wasted resources with a casualness that suggested limitless reserves. But it was the women in uniform that truly shattered comprehension. The Women's Army Corps had been established in 1943, and by war's end, over 150,000 women served in the US military. They worked as clerks, mechanics, drivers, translators, cryptographers, air traffic controllers. They wore the same uniform as male soldiers, lived in barracks, received military rank and pay, followed orders, and gave them. They were not sequestered in separate feminine spheres. They worked alongside men, spoke with authority, moved with confidence through spaces that German women had been taught were exclusively masculine. Lieutenant Martha Rogers, a supply officer from Virginia, recorded her first encounter with German civilians in a letter dated May 15, 1945. The German women watch us with such intensity it's almost unnerving. Not hostility exactly, though there's some of that. More like we're creatures from Mars. Yesterday, one of our sergeants, Betty from Brooklyn, tough as nails, was directing a convoy through a village square, shouting orders, waving trucks through, completely in command. I saw a German woman just staring, absolutely transfixed, and I realized she's never seen a woman do this. Never imagined it was possible. The contrast was visceral, impossible to ignore. Here were American women, young, healthy, loud, laughing, moving through the world as actors rather than objects, as subjects of their own stories rather than supporting characters in men's narratives. They wore trousers. They drove vehicles. They smoked cigarettes openly, joked with male colleagues without deference, made decisions that affected military operations. They seemed to occupy space differently, to move through the world with an ease that suggested they belonged anywhere they chose to be. And they laughed. God, how they laughed. Not the polite, measured laughter of women conscious of being observed and judged. Not the nervous giggle of the subordinate seeking approval. But full-throated, spontaneous, unself-conscious mirth. The kind that comes from genuine enjoyment, from camaraderie, from the simple pleasure of being alive and sharing a moment with friends. They laughed at jokes. They laughed at absurdities. They laughed at nothing in particular, just the relief of tension, the joy of survival, the pure animal pleasure of youth. German women heard this laughter and felt something shift inside them, some long-frozen mechanism beginning, painfully, to thaw. Anneliese Huber was 23 years old in May 1945, living in the ruins of a small Bavarian town with her mother and two younger siblings. Her father had died at Stalingrad. Her husband had vanished somewhere in the Ardennes. She worked in the wreckage of what had been a textile factory, salvaging thread from bombed-out machines. In an oral history recorded in 1978, she described her first extended encounter with American servicewomen. They set up a headquarters in the old mayor's building, and we would see them coming and going. At first, we avoided them. We'd been told Americans were gangsters, violent, dangerous. But we were so hungry, and they had food, and eventually desperation overcomes fear. I went to ask if there was work, anything, in exchange for rations. A sergeant, a woman sergeant, can you imagine, interviewed me. She had red hair, freckles, couldn't have been older than me. She asked me questions in broken German, laughed at her own mistakes, offered me a cigarette. Just like that, no ceremony. I didn't know what to do. In my whole life, I had never been offered a cigarette by another woman. It was a man's thing. But she was holding it out, completely natural, as if this was normal. I took it. My hands were shaking. She noticed and smiled, not mockingly, but kindly, and said something in English I didn't understand. Then she called to another woman across the room, some joke, and they both laughed. That sound, I cannot describe what it did to me. It was like hearing music after years of silence. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was free. Do you understand? It didn't serve any purpose. It wasn't dutiful or controlled. It just was. I stood there, cigarette burning in my hand, and I realized I could not remember the last time I had laughed like that. could not remember if I ever had. The cigarette became, in those strange liminal months of 1945, a symbol of transformation. American cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields, became the most valuable currency in occupied Germany, worth more than Reichsmarks or even dollars. But beyond their economic value, they carried semiotic weight. To smoke was to claim agency, to engage in an act of consumption that served no productive purpose, that existed purely for pleasure. For a woman to smoke in public was to reject the entire architecture of femininity that National Socialism had constructed. And American servicewomen smoked constantly, casually, naturally, without shame or second thought. They lit cigarettes in offices, at truck stops, walking down streets. They shared packs with each other and with German women they befriended. Each time a German woman accepted that offered cigarette, each time she put it to her lips and inhaled, she was performing a small act of revolution, stepping outside the boundaries that had defined her existence. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor universal. Many German women clung to the old certainties, rejecting American women as unfeminine, unnatural, corrupted by liberalism and materialism. They maintained the rigid postures, the controlled expressions, the ideology of maternal sacrifice. The propaganda had worked too well, sunk too deep. Decades later, even after re-education and democratization, even after economic recovery and political transformation, some women of that generation could not entirely shed the disciplines they had learned. Their faces remained masks, their laughter constrained. But others, especially the young, especially those who had lost everything, felt something crack open inside them. Corporal Jane Simmons, a motor pool dispatcher from Chicago, wrote in her diary about a German girl, barely 16, who began hanging around the American compound in June 1945. She never asked for anything directly, just sort of appeared every day, watching. Finally, I offered her a sandwich from the mess. She took it and ate it slowly, like she was trying to make it last forever, which probably she was. Then she just stood there, watching me work. I was signing out vehicles, keeping logs, nothing exciting. But she watched like I was performing surgery. After a few days, she started asking questions in hesitant English. Where was I from? How did I learn this job? Did my father teach me? When I explained I'd learned it in training, that I'd volunteered for the WWII, that my father was a clerk and had nothing to do with it, her face went through such strange contortions. Then she asked the question I could tell she'd been building up to, "Are you married?" When I said no, she looked confused. "But you are old enough. Why does the army permit you to serve if you are not married?" I realized she couldn't conceive of a woman choosing military service over marriage, couldn't imagine it was even possible. I tried to explain, about opportunity, education, seeing the world, serving your country. She listened like I was describing life on another planet. Which, I suppose, I was. The encounters multiplied, accumulated, gradually eroded certainties. German women saw American servicewomen eating meals together in mess halls, their conversations animated and loud, no male authority required to sanction their gathering. They saw them playing softball in improvised fields, their bodies moving with athletic grace, competing and sweating and shouting with unself-conscious vigor. They saw them attending dances where they chose their own partners, or chose not to dance at all, standing in groups discussing whatever interested them, their autonomy assumed rather than requested. And everywhere, always, there was that laughter. The sound of it became a kind of auditory talisman, a signal that another world was possible. It drifted from billets and offices, from trucks and tent cities, from wherever American servicewomen gathered. It punctuated conversations, erupted spontaneously, filled silences that German women had learned to maintain. It was not delicate or decorative, it was full-bodied and genuine, the kind of laughter that comes from people who do not fear being heard, who do not calculate the social consequences of expressing joy. Historians of occupation often focus on the material dimensions of American presence, the Marshall Plan aid, the democratic institutions, the economic reconstruction. But there was another kind of reconstruction happening in those years, subtler and more personal. German women were learning, or relearning, how to inhabit their own bodies, their own voices, their own emotional landscapes without constant reference to masculine authority or nationalist ideology. The process was neither simple nor painless. To recognize that you have been imprisoned requires first acknowledging that you accepted the walls as natural, even necessary. Many German women could not make that leap. They rationalized, defended, insisted that their service had been noble, their suffering meaningful. The Führer had been a father figure, and to reject him was to reject the entire structure of meaning they had built their lives around. But others, slowly, tentatively, began to experiment with new possibilities. They watched the American women and tried on different postures, different tones of voice, different ways of being. They began to speak more directly, to express opinions without seeking permission, to laugh at things they found funny rather than things they were expected to find funny. Greta Hoffmann, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg, described this transformation in an interview conducted in 1969. It was not that we became American, that's what some people said, that we were corrupted, Americanized. But that's not right. We became ourselves, maybe for the first time. Or we became who we might have been if we hadn't been told, every day from childhood, that to be a good woman was to be quiet, obedient, selfless unto extinction. The American girls, they were so young, some of them, younger than my students had been, but they had this quality I can only call presence. They took up space. They made noise. They existed loudly. And watching them, I realized how much energy I had spent my entire life trying to disappear, to be unobtrusive, to serve without being seen. It was exhausting. Freedom, I discovered, is much less tiring than servitude. By 1946, as occupation solidified into something more permanent, the cultural exchange deepened. American servicewomen ran educational programs, teaching German women typing, bookkeeping, English, basic mechanics, practical skills, but also implicitly teaching autonomy, competence, self-reliance. They organized social clubs where German and American women met as colleagues rather than conquerors and conquered. They modeled relationships of equality, where friendship existed between women without constant triangulation through male approval. The German women who participated in these programs, and millions did, found themselves in strange new territory. They learned to shake hands firmly, to make eye contact during conversations, to voice disagreement without framing it as deference. They learned that women could organize their own activities, manage their own time, pursue their own interests without requiring masculine authorization. Small skills, perhaps, but revolutionary in their implications. And they learned to laugh again. Not all at once. Not easily. The wound was too deep, the trauma too fresh, the habit of repression too ingrained. But gradually, in kitchens and classrooms, in work yards and social clubs, the sound began to return, hesitant at first, rusty from disuse, but unmistakably genuine. German women told jokes. They shared absurd stories about the day's disasters. They found humor in the surreal juxtaposition of their new reality. And when they laughed, really laughed, not the careful performance of appropriate amusement, they sounded, for a moment, like the American women who had shown them it was possible. The laughter carried no political program, no ideological manifesto. It did not rebuild cities or democratize institutions. But it did something equally important. It reclaimed emotional autonomy, the right to respond to the world with authentic feeling rather than prescribed reaction. In a society that had demanded absolute conformity, had criminalized individual conscience, had punished spontaneity as weakness, that laughter was a radical act, not because it was defiant, but because it was free. Lieutenant Eleanor Patterson, a Red Cross worker stationed in Munich from 1945 to 1947, wrote in a memoir published in 1982, "The German women I worked with were among the strongest, most resilient people I've ever met. They had survived things I couldn't imagine. But they were also among the most damaged, and not just physically or materially. They had been taught to see their own strength as weakness, their own needs as selfishness, their own voices as problems to be solved through silence. The work of recovery wasn't just about food and shelter and jobs. It was about helping them remember, or discover, that they were human beings with rights and desires and agency. That they didn't have to earn permission to exist. I remember one woman in particular, Ingrid, she was called. She'd lost her husband and both sons in the war, worked 16-hour days in a factory, looked about 60 though she was barely 40. She came to our center for meals, for language classes, for the warmth and company. For weeks, she barely spoke, just listened and watched. Then one day, during a break, someone told a truly terrible joke. I don't even remember what it was, and Ingrid laughed. Not a polite smile, but a real laugh, spontaneous and full. Everyone stopped and stared, and she looked mortified, like she'd done something shameful. But then another woman laughed, and another, and suddenly we were all laughing, at the joke, at Ingrid's face, at nothing and everything. And I watched Ingrid's expression change as she realized she wasn't being punished, wasn't being judged, was in fact being welcomed. That's when I understood that laughter wasn't just recreation. It was resistance, against despair. Yes, but also against the whole ideology that had told these women their only value lay in silent suffering. The symbolic power of that laughter extended far beyond individual moments. It became part of the larger mythology of American liberation, not just from fascism, but from the ideologies of subordination that fascism had systematized but not invented. In the decades that followed, as West Germany rebuilt itself into a prosperous democracy, the memory of those American servicewomen persisted in the cultural imagination. They appeared in memoirs, novels, films, often idealized, sometimes resented, but always remembered as avatars of possibility, embodiments of a different way of being female. This mythology was not entirely accurate, of course. The United States in 1945 was hardly a feminist utopia. American women faced their own restrictions, discriminations, glass ceilings. Many servicewomen were forced out of their military roles after the war, expected to return to domestic life, their contributions minimized or forgotten. The racial segregation of the U.S. military meant that black servicewomen experienced both the authority of uniform and the humiliation of Jim Crow, their laughter often edged with bitterness at the contradictions they embodied. But mythology need not be entirely accurate to be powerful. For German women emerging from totalitarianism, those American servicewomen represented something real and valuable. Proof that women could live differently, could claim authority and autonomy, could laugh freely without fear. Whether or not American society fully delivered on that promise was less important than the fact that the promise existed, had been made visible, had shown itself as possible. In the immediate post-war years, as Germany divided and the Cold War froze the continent into opposing camps, the memory of that laughter took on additional resonance. East German propaganda denounced the American occupation as decadent, corrupt, a betrayal of genuine socialist liberation. They portrayed American servicewomen as frivolous, sexually promiscuous, vapid consumers, exactly the accusations the Nazis had made. The ideology had changed. The critique of female autonomy remained. West German women, meanwhile, found themselves navigating a complex terrain. Democracy had been imposed, not chosen, and many of its assumptions remained alien. The economic miracle of the 1950s brought prosperity but also a return to conservative gender roles. The Wirtschaftswunder was built partly on women retreating from factories back to homes. Yet the seed had been planted, the possibility glimpsed. The women's movement that emerged in the 1970s drew consciously on that memory, often invoking the image of liberated American women as counterpoint to German patriarchy. And always, in the stories passed down, the memoirs written, the oral histories collected, there returned that central image. American women in uniform, laughing freely, unself-consciously, joyfully, and German women watching, transfixed, as something long frozen inside them began, finally, to thaw. The laughter was never just laughter. It was a sound that carried with it an entire philosophy of human dignity, of individual rights, of freedom understood not just as political abstraction but as lived experience. It was the sound of women who had been raised to believe that their thoughts mattered, their voices had weight, their happiness was not subordinate to collective destiny. It was the sound of people who knew, with bone-deep certainty, that they had the right to take up space, to express themselves, to exist as subjects rather than objects. For German women who had spent 12 years, or longer, if you counted the conservative patriarchy that preceded Nazism, learning to silence themselves, that sound was revelation. It suggested that the ideology they had internalized, the disciplines they had mastered, the sacrifices they had made were not natural or necessary but contingent and constructed. It suggested that other ways of being were possible, that the walls around them were not architecture of reality but artifacts of power. This realization was, for many, almost unbearably painful. To recognize you have been imprisoned means confronting the years lost, the self-suppressed, the potential unrealized. Some could not bear it, turned away, clung to the familiar certainties even as they crumbled. But others, enough others, walked through that door, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. They learned to laugh again. Not all at once, not completely, not without scars. But they learned. 7 to 9 years later, in living rooms and care facilities across Germany, a few women remain who remember that sound. They are in their 90s now, the last generation to have adult memories of the war. They remember hunger and terror, loss and shame, the apocalyptic landscape of 1945. They remember the Americans arriving with their impossible abundance, their casual confidence, their strange generosity toward the defeated. And they remember the laughter. In interviews, their faces change when they recall it. Something shifts, softens, even now. They speak of hearing that sound for the first time, of watching those women in uniform move through the world with such ease, such self-possession. They speak of the confusion and wonder it provoked, the questions it raised about everything they had been taught. They speak, sometimes haltingly, about learning, relearning, how to laugh themselves. It was freedom, one of them says, her voice still carrying the accent of Bavaria, her hands folded in her lap in that careful way that never entirely disappears. Not just political freedom, we barely understood what that meant. But something more basic. The freedom to feel what you felt, to say what you thought, to be who you were without needing permission. The freedom to laugh at something funny simply because it was funny, not because it served some purpose or pleased some authority. The American girls had that freedom. They wore it like their uniforms, just as natural. And watching them, we began to understand what we had lost, what we might reclaim. The laughter echoes still, distant now but never quite silent. It drifted across rubble-strewn streets in the spring of 1945, and in its wake left changed women, altered possibilities, new ways of imagining what it meant to be human. It was not the only force that rebuilt Germany, not the only influence that shaped post-war democracy. But it was there, woven into the fabric of transformation, a sound as revolutionary as any manifesto, as powerful as any political program. The sound of women laughing freely, claiming space, asserting presence. The sound of freedom, unguarded